Hello, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you who connected to our webinar today. The topic of the day, as you know, will be 5G update, and strapline is accelerate your 5G business. And in a minute, you will find out why we think you, as in companies working in the telecom industry, need to accelerate their 5G plans. Presenting today for you, there will be myself. My name is Dario Talmesio. I'm a principal analyst and practice leader at Ovum, and my colleague Julian Bright, who is a senior analyst in our network practice. Good afternoon, Julian.
Hello, Dario. Thank you very much. Okay. Hello, everybody. Just by way of introduction, I'm going to just run through a few points that we'll be addressing during this webinar. Looking broadly at where we are now with 5G and what to expect over the coming months and the initial period when services start to be rolled out. I think the general view we're seeing an overall acceleration in the 5G industry. We're seeing a growing number of launch announcements coming through from operators. We're seeing device announcements about availability of various types of devices, but most notably smartphones, and some indications as to when those will start to appear. Spectrum is being made available for 5G services. Auctions are happening, and regulators and governments are identifying the bands that will be adopted for 5G. Network equipment is starting to ship in significant volumes as the operators prepare their 5G networks for imminent launch. That's certainly those operators who are perhaps in the vanguard of 5G. And I think it's true to say there's a growing sort of anticipation and excitement around a lot of the 5G network features. So I'm now going to hand back to Dario, who's going to talk a little bit about how quickly things are moving now and what operators' plans are around 5G.
Thank you, Julian. In order to show you the state and the future of the industry in relation to 5G, a couple of points. The format that we decided to adopt today is slightly unusual. It's not going to be just running through some slides, but we've decided to listen to our customers over the year and pick their most interesting questions about 5G. So we obviously anonymized those questions, and we made it and we generalized it as much as possible so that you can see what real companies who are working on their 5G plans are most interested in, and they engage with us on these topics. Obviously, we try to keep it as anonymous as possible. The other point I would like to make, please do drop your questions in the question box as we go along during our chat between myself and Julian, and we will answer your questions at the end of the webinar. Now, as Julian was asking, where is the 5G world now and where it's going to go? We obviously identified the market opportunity of 5G. We've been running our 5G forecast for more than 2 years now, and we have been updating it on a regular basis. Our latest 5G forecast for number of connections is 1.3 billion by 2023, and that is representing roughly 15% of the global market. Now, those do not include the sub-market of FWA, which we will discuss later on, and does not include the number of 5G-related IoT connections, which we will discuss later on. When we want to see which countries, regions, and operators are leading the 5G market. Obviously, we are talking about some of the usual suspects, but also some of the new suspects of 5G. I think it's fair to say that the US market is going to be leading the 5G world with AT&T, Verizon, and T-Mobile being extremely aggressive in their plans and making a number of announcements as the market develops. But also, and this is probably a departure from what happened in the 4G world, we see that China is becoming the, not leader maybe, but powerhouse of 5G in many respects. Just a couple of days ago, the China Mobile Partner Conference in Guangzhou, they highlighted how they want to progress with 5G. They showed which devices they are going to introduce in market first. And while the US market is going to be leading in terms of penetration in respect to their own market, when we're talking about the absolute size of the 5G world measured in number of connections, by 2023, China will be the leading market with approaching or actually surpassing 500 million connections on 5G. That will make them the absolute powerhouse of 5G in terms of sheer volumes. Now, one of the interesting points that we've been discussing over the year with our customers is why Europe is behind. Is Europe really behind, or why is not moving along with the pack? And it is correct. Europe is slightly behind when we compare it to China, US, Korea, Japan. However, it's not that much far behind. I think one of the most interesting aspects of the 5G world in comparison to, let's say, 4G, 3G, or 2G is that the entire world of telecom operators is moving in a very synchronized fashion. The pack is getting there, not together, but the distance between the leading and the followers is not as wide as it used to be. And that is an important departure from what we have seen in the previous years, or in the previous iteration of the many Gs we've been following. As a result, the 5G adoption in many countries or in many respects is going to be faster than what we have seen in 4G, for instance, simply because the scale is getting there at market altogether rather than in a gradual fashion. Having said that, there are many differences in the world of 5G. Now we open up a little bit more into what it is, more of a country by country or sub-region by sub-region. I have said that US, China, Korea, and Japan, and eventually a bit later Europe are entering or leading the 5G story, but there are some important exceptions in those markets that are normally laggard markets. So there are some important operators in Middle East, in Africa, or even Latin America that will be implementing 5G more or less at the same time as the leading operators in the world. More details, obviously, you can have by accessing our analysts in those regions. Something we haven't probably mentioned at the start of this webinar is that it's not just Julian and myself doing this. It's part of a collective effort across the world in putting together very, very different views and very, very different bits and pieces of information about the 5G world. The important data point that I would like to highlight here is the number of live 5G networks that we are going to have by the end of 2023, and that is going to be approaching 200 networks, which is a sizable number in relation to what we have seen, for instance, back in the 4G days. Now, for those of you who have been following the 5G development over the past few years, there is always a recurring question, which is, okay, the networks are getting ready, the licenses are being awarded, but what about the devices? And up until fairly recently, I would say very recently, the devices that we have been able to see in the market were not probably ready for what we call a consumer adoption. I think a big piece of news is actually coming from this week, when for the first time we see a device, a smartphone, that is similar to what consumers are expected to use or expected to have in their hands, and that is good news for what concerns the market adoption of 5G services and connections and subscriptions and devices. Simply because we have now the certainty that we will see next year in market smartphones before before the first half of next year. We will see smartphones in market being sold to paying customers. And it's not just smartphones. If you look at those logos that we've put on this slide, obviously it's not just smartphones, it's also hotspots type of connectivity, is also some laptops, it's also modules for IoT connectivity. So the entire ecosystem of, let's call it access points, including smartphones, is getting there. And this is probably the most significant acceleration that we have seen over the past few months, which is the one about the end user devices. And we are talking about maybe an acceleration of about 6 months compared to what we had been expecting in the past. Okay, so having said that, the market is accelerating. The market has accelerated. The operators are getting ready with networks. They are getting ready acquiring licenses. We have seen, obviously, Qualcomm from this week, actually, conference demoing prototype devices and explaining to the market that soon their partners will introduce smartphones in the market. But we cannot ignore that there is a big question mark around Apple readiness. And the question is very simple. We've been asked this question several times, which is when. Let's not forget that in many or in some of the markets we've just mentioned, that are markets that we expect to be leading the 5G world, Apple has a share of in excess of 60%. And obviously without the contribution of the Apple ecosystem and the Apple devices, the market will find it difficult to accelerate. Obviously, Apple hasn't communicated to the outside world when they are expecting to introduce their first 5G iPhone. And normally they don't communicate too far ahead before the launch. But if Apple is behaving or will behave the same way they have done in the past in regard to the Gs of launches. We cannot expect them to be to introduce the first iPhone until 2021. Obviously, the acceleration of at least 6 months that we have assisted in recent months is going to put some additional pressure on the company. But one of the assumptions that we have been using in our forecast is that Apple wouldn't change their usual behavior. And therefore, our numbers do consider the 2021 mark for Apple devices. And here, obviously, it opens up a whole host of questions about is there a first mover advantage? Is there a first mover premium? Or is it better to wait for technology to be mature or for the customers to be ready? It varies. The reality of the answer is that it does vary on a market by market. One piece of advice that we normally give to our customers here, not just OEMs, but especially network operators, is that if they do decide to be first, if they do decide to eventually consider a premium, the first mover advantage is not a given, and it's not always there. First, being first doesn't necessarily mean being the best. Being first is just one of the many requisites that you need to have in order to have an advantage. And of course, when we look at those operators who launched first, 4G for instance, some of them actually suffered as a result of launching too early. Overall, there is an intuition that there is a first mover advantage, but there are many other things that need to be done right if you want to be first, including network prices, proposition, services, and so on and so forth. But let's move, talking about the readiness and how to get ready, let's go back to Julian and see a little bit about the technology itself and how the maturity is getting there. So Julian, how will 5G rollout be different from 4G, for instance? And what pattern will network deployment follow?
Okay, thank you very much, Dario. Yes, okay, 5G rollout. What I have here is a slide which presents some sort of fairly crude, but I hope instructive, parallels between the expected rollout of 5G and the experience we went through with 4G. So looking at where, well, let's say the phase we've been through or just coming through, which really corresponds, I think, with the sort of pre-4G era, if we think back to those times when 3G networks were being enhanced, HSPA was being introduced, network performance capacity was being expanded. In a similar fashion, operators have been upgrading their LTE networks, introducing new technologies such as MIMO, carrier aggregation, and really sort of building up those capabilities ahead of the introduction of 5G. A lot of those technologies, of course, feed through into the 5G standards, and I think there's a sort of, to draw a parallel there, we're sort of currently, or we have been passing through that phase, if you like. Where we're moving to now is to the initial launch phase. And in many ways, there are parallels here, I think, with 4G, in that early 5G will be an enhancement to the 4G model or architecture, if you like. So the pattern of services, support for smartphones, will be broadly a continuation, if you like, of the 4G era. The main difference, I think, will be the introduction of the new 5G interface, and that actually will be the sort of the main driver, if you like, of the enhanced performance capabilities that we're going to see with early 5G networks. Of course, in addition to enhanced mobile broadband, we'll see some deployments of fixed network solutions around 5G, and Dario and I will talk a little bit more about those further into the presentation. But so there we have 5G new radio. We have a broadly a continuation, if you like, of what we saw with 4G as part of the phase 1 5G deployments. That's probably a little premature. I put up that final banner. Just to go to the third arrow here in this picture, the phase 2 elements of 5G will perhaps be where we start to divert, if you like, from the 4G model, and where the parallel here starts to sort of diverge, because in its second phase, 5G will move into sort of a new realm, if you like. Some of those initial deployments, most of which will be tied or anchored into 4G LTE networks using the enhanced packet core that we employed for 4G and employed in what is called a non-standalone mode. A lot of those will start to move into a full standalone 5G deployment, which will utilize the 5G packet core and give operators an opportunity to really start building and developing those additional capabilities which 5G in its full deployment phase will start to offer. So that's the third part of this progression, if you like. And then we move into full 5G, which, to draw a parallel here and continue this analogy, is where we currently are with LTE. So LTE is a mature technology. We understand its capabilities. The improvements and enhancements that are happening with LTE are still ongoing, but really I think we're seeing 4G networks in very much a state of maturity. When will we get to this point with 5G? Well, we're looking really out to 2022 and beyond, when we can start to see the implementation of some of the new network architectures that are envisaged for 5G, such as multi-access edge computing, such as network slicing. Some of these capabilities built around the 5G network, which are really going to start to support many of the new use cases that are envisaged for the full 5G network as it's really envisaged, looking out into the future. So if you like, it's another long-term evolution story. It may be that in the early phases, as we're seeing, there is significant acceleration, I think, of progress. But further out, some of those questions about how networks change and develop, how some of these new architectures are implemented, really start to come into play and really begin to somehow cloud the issue around how quickly we move to that full phase of 5G. So I think there are still a lot of questions around how and where we reach that stage of full maturity. So just to put a little more detail into this, how will the networks evolve to support new services and use cases? Well, as the previous slide showed, there's an initial phase where we're moving to enhanced mobile broadband and fixed wireless access, higher speeds, more capacity, the 5G new radio air interface being introduced initially on a non-standalone basis, and really an evolution of 4G, a network which delivers greater capabilities, faster speeds, more capacity, which does so in a more efficient way and which can introduce some economies, I think, for operators. But in terms of the business model, it's really more of what we see today. In terms of spectrum, I'm showing here that the low, mid, and high bands are all being deployed in various scenarios. I think it's true to say that there are examples around the world of operators using all bands from all of these different segments. So multiple bands, but probably initially operators will opt for specific bands and launch in those particular frequencies. And there'll be a little more information on that in a later slide. And then we move to phase two, the migration, as I said, to a standalone network architecture. And we expect this to happen fairly quickly, following on from the non-standalone deployments. Operators will start to move to a standalone model. We expect perhaps 2 years, 1 to 2 years further down the line, as and when they have the capability to do that. This will certainly be those who are in the more advanced phase of 5G deployments, because the business model for 5G, when you're looking further beyond initial services, is really predicated on having that standalone network capability and the full 5G core network in place to support these new kinds of network architectures and services. So the two primary ones, which I think are most often discussed, network slicing, which uses virtual network technology to build multiple networks on a single platform. So you can support a multiplicity of services with different demands, different requirements, different speeds, latency, different use cases. So examples here, perhaps a traditional smartphone network, perhaps support for autonomous vehicles, industrial applications. You can run those in parallel across virtual network implementations on a single platform, which really starts to deliver on the flexibility, the full flexibility that 5G is promising. And the other architecture here we're looking at is the concept of multi-access edge computing, which is really the more highly distributed cloud computing capability that supports a lot of those applications that operators might want to deploy locally and support locally, particularly those that demand ultra-low latency, such as augmented or virtual reality, or again, autonomous vehicles, industrial systems. In both cases, these are significant developments in terms of how the network is architected. And we have some thoughts on how quickly these might come into play and how and where they might be deployed, which I'll talk a little more about. But I think the message at this point is really, in this next phase, in the phase two and moving into the full phase of 5G, far greater complexity in the network, which is a challenge for operators, a huge challenge. And that complexity will be something that they will need to come to terms with if they're going to realize the full capabilities of 5G. The new business cases will help to drive these new architectures, and there's a question around which comes first, whether you deploy a network slicing or an edge computing solution to support specific use cases, or whether the desire to deliver those use cases really is the driver more for the underlying network technology. But either way, operators will need far greater levels of automation and orchestration across their networks in order to manage these new architectures. And that too will be something which will need to flow as part of this sort of evolution across the 5G landscape. At that point, I'm going to hand back to Dario, who's going to just talk a little bit more about what this means for operators' services.
Thank you, Julian. Yes, we say that the first 5G services will be introduced next year. The first smartphones, the first hotspots, the first fixed wireless access. will be there already in the first half of next year. And maybe the IoT part of the 5G story in volumes is going to take a little bit longer, but obviously we already see many deployments or actually many trials, correctly, in industrial applications or private campus type of application for industry and manufacturing. So there is an underlying question about how do mobile operators or fixed line operators will manage to monetize these services, and what's different from the previous implementations or the previous iteration of G's technologies. And when we look at one by one things that consumers and enterprises will pay for, we need to break it down by services. And often these services are defined by the way that the networks are accessed by customers. So we have FWA, we have mobile hotspots and smartphones, and mobile tablets and PCs, each of which will have an underlying commonality, which is charging per access, which is essentially charging for data. But obviously one of the main characteristics and feature of 5G is the fact that there is an extremely low latency, or expected to be extremely low latency at a much greater speed. So each one of those services will eventually have their own different kind of monetization, which in the majority of cases, or in many cases, will be created. Those specific services other than access will be created in partnership or directly offered to customers from third-party partners of operators. So if we look, for instance, and luckily we can already put names next to monetization strategies. If we look at the way Verizon has announced their first their first 5G services in FWA, we see that the bundling of content and gaming and entertainment services comes as a default, or comes as a given. So it's no longer one of the many pricing options, and eventually not the preferred pricing option. So there will be more collaboration and more co-interest from partners, and here I'm talking about the so-called hyperscale partners, in seeing these networks being deployed to the benefit of the end users, which are co-customers in some cases. So that is the not only applying to FWA, but certainly is going to be applying to the smartphone. Now, smartphone, or EMBB as we call it in technology terms, and tablets and PCs, and mobile PCs, are going to be the vast majority of the 5G market in the foreseeable future, and they will represent probably 99% of the market for quite some time, and that means that those applications and those monetization opportunities will tend to revolve the features that smartphones and networks will offer. I said it before, latency is going to be the most important one, simply because it can allow operators not necessarily to offer different pricing plans that are attached to latency, but partner with different service providers of applications that are going to be using latency and speed. Obviously, one of the big promises or big drivers of of 5G is augmented reality or immersive reality or any of permutation of such, depending on which marketing department of you talk to. But the concept is the same, which is radically changing the user experience in the hope that there will be more direct and indirect monetization. Something that we probably haven't mentioned just yet, and is going to be critical, especially in the IoT or the industrial 5G, is the fact that enterprise partners will eventually be interested in having more ownership or more control of the network in their campuses or in their machinery, on their production lines. So one of the opportunity, but which is still to a point, the question mark is that will these companies be interested in co-investing in the 5G deployment? And if so, who will these companies buy equipment from? Is it going to be the traditional mobile operator or fixed or integrated operator, or will these organizations, industrial organizations, go directly to the network equipment vendors to satisfy their needs? I think we would like to answer every question, but probably this is the question that is still remains slightly unanswered. But there is definitely more. If we compare it to the past, where in the past there was very limited chance for a vendor to sell directly to enterprise, now it becomes a bit more feasible and a bit more plausible that it will happen. So a combination of the two will be there. And I'll pass it back to Julian to discuss a bit more in detail the FWA case, which is the one we already see today being deployed, actually the first one that has been deployed so far.
Thank you, Dario. Yeah, just to explore a little bit that opportunity, the fixed wireless solution, looking perhaps at the opportunities for operators on the consumer side. Clearly, a fixed wireless solution can deliver high speed, ultra high speed, high quality of service type connectivity. Given the capabilities of 5G, you're talking at sort of speeds that are far closer to those achievable today with fiber networks. You can support multiple streams, or need to support multiple streams with support for applications such as HD video, online gaming, a host of applications really. Certainly home broadband support would be much enhanced if you can deliver a fixed 5G wireless solution. Opportunities as well as sort of individual home service could be to deliver fixed 5G to apartment buildings with where you have line of sight and you can have a high capacity link. These might prove a useful target for operators, which can provide a high speed connection which can then be distributed in building, perhaps using Wi-Fi or Ethernet. On the enterprise side, as Dario said, there's an opportunity here that probably extends beyond service providers, perhaps to equipment vendors. But I think the enterprise is very much a focus for 5G, and certainly a lot of the early solutions are predicated around enterprise. The enterprise opportunity and around businesses and industrial solutions. Fixed wireless wouldn't have necessarily to be the primary connection. It could be a fail-safe connection provided to a business. It could use the high-capacity millimeter wave spectrum, for example, and target not coverage so much as perhaps on the consumer side of things, but more as a build as needed approach where operators can more closely address specific enterprise or industrial customers with a more bespoke wireless solution. Support specific applications. If they can start to introduce some of those additional capabilities that I talked of earlier, such as network slicing and edge computing, then they can certainly build new applications around those. And I think it may well be that a lot of those types of architectures will be implemented first in these kind of industrial and enterprise customer in this sector, rather than perhaps in the wider consumer in the consumer domain. And clearly, you can do a lot more in terms of delivering, for example, on service level guarantees around these kinds of solutions. Other opportunities as well beyond businesses and enterprises, looking at more public services, schools, public centres, hospitals, a whole host of opportunities really around the 5G fixed wireless model. I'll hand back now to Dario to pick up the story.
Yeah, on the fixed wireless model, it's obviously the first case we have seen being trialed by operators in many markets, and I think the interesting part of the FWA case is some of it is the usual, so to speak, the opportunity for challengers without mobile and necessarily having access to fixed networks to use it as a game changer for market share and entering a new segment to them. But I think a good departure from the past is that the FWA with 5G is also giving certain capacity that probably wasn't there before. Obviously, the FWA market has existed for many years. For those who have been around enough, we will remember WiMAX, which didn't quite live up to the expectations. But the FWA market today is largely based on LTE, and it's a growing market in its own right. We are expecting, obviously, this market to continue to grow, mainly because there is support for it from various players, not the traditional challengers, but also many incumbents that are using it to integrate their existing plans of fixed, even fiber-based fixed line plans. We need obviously to put this into the context, the wider context of fixed line and the wider context of 5G. So we are talking about roughly 2 to 3% of the total fixed broadband market to be addressed and serviced by FWA, which is significant. It doesn't look that big when compared to the context of it, but in certain markets we can see very easily FWA to take up to 10-15% of the fixed line market, and clearly this is an opportunity for challengers, but it's also an opportunity for incumbent operators. Something that I think is worth mentioning here is that it's real. You and I have been on enough trials, and we have seen enough demos with testing equipment that shows how fast these connections are. And we have seen some, we are talking maybe about a point-to-point type of implementation, but I vividly remember the Orange trial where I saw a speed in excess of consistently in excess of a gigabit per second download, which is truly impressive. It's certainly not something I have in my home at the moment. But clearly it does exist within the context of a wider technology options and adoptions. And of course, it varies based on the type of spectrum that is being utilized. And on that point, I think I'll send it back to you talking about spectrum.
Thank you, Dario. Yeah, okay, just to sort of close things off, just a quick word here on spectrum bands, spectrum adoption for 5G. I think the primary message here really is that operators will invariably launch 5G in those bands that are available to them in this initial phase. The opportunity really is growing around the sort of mid-range bands around 3.5 gigahertz, where I think we'll see the majority of operators begin to deliver services in most markets. There are clearly exceptions to this, but certainly 3.5 or the C-band spectrum is emerging as the most popular in a sort of global sense. However, there are clearly exceptions, as we would expect, and if you look at USA, for example, T-Mobile is an interesting case in point. They have 600 megahertz spectrum that they're planning to use, in addition to there's 2.5 and 28 gigahertz spectrum also available in the US market. Certainly operators like T-Mobile are looking at sort of trying to utilize a broad swathe of spectrum bands. If you look at Japan, which tends to often go its own way in terms of spectrum, there's certainly bands around the sort of mid-range, 3.6 to 4.2 gigahertz, but also other bands coming into play at slightly higher frequencies and into the millimeter wave spectrum range. China, as Dario said, one of the sort of major markets in the early phase of 5G, also expected to adopt 3.5 gigahertz, which we're expecting to be awarded shortly, but also looking at other bands around 2.6 and 4.9 gigahertz. I think, as I say, the message is that operators will go with what's available to them, but in a broader sense, there's perhaps not exactly a proliferation of bands, but certainly a number of bands emerging for 5G. We had those concerns around LTE in the early days about the multiplicity of bands that were being used. Perhaps we're better placed, or device providers are better placed to support a higher range of bands, but I think the issue with 5G is really that those bands are so diverse, and they do extend from sub 1 gigahertz up to millimeter wave bands, well into the sort of 50, 60 gigahertz range if the industry takes it to that level. So I mean, clearly there's a challenge there, I think, in the sheer range of bands that will need to be supported, and the specific issues around those, such as sort of integration of antennas and how you support simply that range of diverse bands. But that's broadly the picture as we see it currently in terms of spectrum. So, shall I just run through our conclusions, Dario? So we, broadly speaking, just to wrap up, we see the industry has accelerated. We've already seen certainly things moving ahead more quickly than we anticipated here at Ovum in the earlier phases of 5G, or preparations for 5G, 6 months ahead of our original projections. Next year, from testing to implementation, but the real year when things, I think, or we think, will start to move at faster pace is 2020 onwards. A lot of those new features and the architectures that are associated with 5G will start to become available on a commercial basis as we move out to those projected dates, 2021, 22. But I think this will be the start. We won't see ubiquitous deployments of, for example, multi-access edge computing on networks, but we'll see operators start to explore the possibilities and perhaps in a limited fashion to try and understand how those technologies could work for them. The monetization challenges, how will they be overcome? Well, media, entertainment, enterprise-specific services. Certainly, those are the opportunities as we see them, but still a large part of that monetization will come from unlimited data access. I think that broadly sums up our presentation. I think we can move on to
Thank you, Julian. Thank you for the concluding remarks. And I've seen we have already quite a few questions coming in. I might start reading a couple out to you, Julian. I hope I don't put you on the spot, but we are talking about 4G in this question. It's not because we are going backward, but because it's an essential part of 5G. I'm trying to summarize the different questions we had, but on a similar topic, which is, I would say part number one is 4G with this anticipation of 5G coming into market very, very soon. Do we actually think that operators will stop investing in 4G now because there will be a possibility of an investment in 5G soon, a little bit later? And in relation to that is how do we see the VoLTE market, which is again an essential part of the upgrade story, not only to 4G but to 5G. If I can elaborate a little bit, is how do we move voice away from 3G and 2G networks, and how quickly that is happening, and do we think it's eventually not moving fast enough to accommodate 5G?
Okay. Yeah. Thanks, Dario. Yes, on that point about investment in 4G, well, the answer, of course, is no. It would be a mistake to cease investing in 4G or to pull back to too significant an extent. 4G is, after all, the sort of the underlying technology that will continue to support 5G. 5G will not be ubiquitous in any sort of part of this early phase of deployments, and operators need their 4G networks to sort of cushion the 5G services, to provide the underlying technology that users will invariably fall back to when they're outside of 5G coverage areas. And the better your 4G network performs, the less painful an experience that will be for users, I think. So it's a challenge, I know, but I think somehow operators will need to certainly maintain and, where possible, enhance their 4G networks on a continuing basis, certainly until 5G is more widely deployed. On the point about VoLTE, well, 4G will also at the same time be the primary network for supporting VoLTE service, I think. So far, migration 2G, 3G voice onto 4G has not been significantly, not been quickly implemented by a majority of operators. I think there needs to be a more aggressive move to try and move voice services across 4G and to support VoLTE, because where you have a 4G, 5G network environment, if you can also carry voice over that network, then clearly you are in an advantageous position. Some operators will be looking to shut down 2G or 3G networks, and in preparation for that, also you need to start moving those services across. So I think some perhaps increased momentum in VoLTE implementation is really probably called for.
It's probably next year will be the big year of 4G actually, and when we think about it, the greatest updates of 4G networks will eventually happen next year.
Yes, yeah. Well, I certainly. I mean, it's ongoing at the moment. I think, yeah, the clearly where we're talking about 5G in 2019, we're talking about a very small number of operators. Those whose plans are really well advanced. The majority are okay, watching what happens, trying to understand developments around 5G, but their focus still is very much on 4G, on infilling the coverage and capacity for 4G, on really improving and enhancing that network. So yeah, I mean, for the majority of operators, this will still be their primary focus.
Thank you, Julian. And we have a question on a fairly sensitive topic, which is very much about regions that are not US and they are not China. So specifically Europe, Africa, Middle East, and Latin America, with the nervousness that there is at the moment around the usage of 5G equipment coming from Chinese vendors. Would that affect any of the market? And I think Ovum position here is fairly clear. We do not analyze network security ourselves. Our expertise is in analyzing market dynamics and technologies and how enterprises and consumers use technology and spend money on technology and how operators invest in it. But clearly, if we reduce, and if that ever happens, if you reduce the number of suppliers, if you take the suppliers, some of the leading suppliers out of the equation, it can only result in, it could possibly result actually in higher prices and eventually stifle innovation. And it's not our judgment to talk about any national security concern, but we look at market performance, and that is the conclusion that we have. If it happens, it would surely undermine the performance of those markets that do not benefit from a wide and diverse ecosystem of vendors.
Yeah. Okay. That's fair enough.
And I think we have probably just a couple of minutes, 1 minute actually. So we need to choose a very, very short answer, a short question and answer. Obviously, those questions that we are not able to answer today will be sent directly to you via email. I'm just trying to pick one that has a very, very short. Oh, do you think that 5G would be cost effective as a home solution, or do we think that essentially 5G can provide cost effectively home connectivity to end users? I can give a very short one and then you can add something. I hate to answer this way, but it depends. It depends on which network you're using, which spectrum, whether you're talking about the C-band or millimeter wave. It depends on the existing fiber or DSL-based or cable-based footprint. The reality is that the cost of deploying wireless network, generally speaking, is much cheaper than digging up roads, as we all know. obviously, in the long run, the cost of running wireless networks tend to be higher than the one of running fiber networks. But I think the bottom line on the FWA market is that, generally speaking, we are not talking about national deployments or national business cases. The business cases are very, very punctual and very, very confined, not even in a regional way or not even in a city by city, but probably postcode by postcode, to use a British classification. Julian, you wanted to add
just briefly, yes. Well, I think part of the reason we looked at enterprise use cases is because those can be sort of more effectively monetized, certainly for fixed wireless. A 5G fixed wireless solution would be a sort of high performance, high capacity premium service. LTE fixed wireless is already addressing a lot of the sort of broader connectivity challenges for home broadband. So I think that will cover a large swathe of the market. For 5G fixed wireless, I think, yeah, the opportunities have to be approached selectively, and I think operators will want to be assured of the sort of the economic viability of those. But I think, you know, where they can deliver a fiber-like service, then there is an opportunity certainly there.
Okay, well, I think we would like to have more time to go through all the questions, but luckily we can respond directly to you one by one, and I'm sure we will also meet in person or via a call or via email with all of you. I just want to thank you all for listening to our webinar today. And to share your questions that are beneficial for the wider audience of Ovum base. And thank you to Julian for participating and sharing his knowledge and views on the market.
Thank you, Dario, and thanks everybody for dialing today.
A recorded version will be available, and a copy of the slide will be available to download to all participants. Thank you very much.